Welcome back. 17 past the hour. Well, the numbers are really shocking. Out of the 225 abortion clinics operating in New York, now we know only 17 of them were inspected over a period of 13 years. And that means, according to the New York Post, that New York City tanning salons are better inspected and more regularly inspected than our abortion clinics. And we're going to talk about it now with Greg Pfundstein. He is president of the Chiaroscuro Foundation, which obtained this shocking new information. And it's just great to welcome Greg back to the show. Greg, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me again.
Oh, thank you. Now, I understand you guys obtained these records and that the Kermit Gosnell situation sort of inspired you to do this. What was your thinking in trying to go after these inspection records?
Yeah, that's right. It was about a year ago now during the Kermit Gosnell trial that it came out that the state of Pennsylvania had made a political decision to stop inspecting abortion clinics. It was actually a pro-choice Republican governor, I think it was Tom Ridge, who instructed the health department to stop inspecting clinics. And when we heard that, we wondered whether or not in New York clinics were being inspected. We put in some time and effort trying to discover just how many abortion clinics there were in New York. We were focusing on the city primarily.
Right.
And then we noticed that the Guttmacher Institute claims there are 225 abortion clinics in the state. So that's when we went and we hadn't drafted a Freedom of Information request, and we sent it to the Department of Health. We actually sent one to the city as well. The city got back to us pretty quickly and told us that they don't do any inspections of any clinics, licensed or unlicensed.
Wow.
And it took us about a year to get the information from the state. They denied the request and we appealed, and then they denied it again and we sued them and so forth and so on. And then 10 months later, we had a couple thousand pages of documents that are now available on our website.
Good grief. Now, how many clinics are there in New York City proper?
Well, it's not as easy to answer that question as you might think. Based on various pro-life organizations' websites and then internet searches, yellow pages, these sorts of things, we think there's something on the order of 95 to 100 in the city. Clinics that offer abortion and advertise for it in some way. The difficulty is, knowing whether those are all active or, and so forth and so on. We actually spent a day last spring, in this context when we were trying to do this request. My colleague Jeremy and I drove around the outer boroughs out in the Bronx and out in Queens and Brooklyn, stopping by some of these addresses to see if there's actually a clinic there. And sometimes it was a little tough to tell. So, it's a little tricky, but what we know for certain is there are only 25 clinics that the state thinks it has any responsibility for. And of those, there are 8 of them that have never been inspected.
That is unbelievable. Now, when you went to the New York City officials and they were quick to get back to you, you said we don't inspect them. Is there any law that says they're required to inspect them?
So this is the state's argument, and frankly, from the perspective of the law, I think it's accurate. The only thing that the law requires in New York to perform an abortion is that you be a licensed physician.
Okay.
No other requirement. Now, there are certain types of clinics that have certain types of licenses over which the state has the responsibility and the ability for oversight and regulation, including inspections. Of those types of clinics, there are apparently only 25 that have in their operating certificates abortion services as one of the things that they're licensed to do.
Wow.
So the state's argument is only those 25 do they have any responsibility over. Now the open question is, does anyone have any responsibility to inspect the other 200 clinics that are, or clinics and providers that are there operating in the state?
Yeah.
And on what basis is it that we think that we should just ignore all these other providers?
Well, I'm looking, for example, the New York Post had put this in here, a letter from the health department that said some facilities are not required to have abortion services in their operating certificates in order to perform abortions, and which is just what you just mentioned. Why are they allowed to do that? How in the world can you be allowed to do abortions if it's not even part of what you're doing in your operating certificate? I mean, what other business would be allowed to do something that significant, a medical procedure like that, without having it delineated in the operating certificate?
Yeah, I guess you have to think of it from the perspective of, the pro-abortion side. And New York's law was changed in 1970, actually prior to Roe v. Wade. That's when abortion was legalized in New York State. So the law in the state goes back even before Roe v. Wade. But even in the context of Roe v. Wade, it talks about a decision being between a woman and her physician. So from the perspective of the pro-abortion lobby and the pro-abortion industry, a doctor doesn't have to have a special license, for instance, to do a hernia operation versus, setting a bone or something along these lines. He doesn't have to have a particular license for some particular medical procedure.
Right.
So I think their argument is basically, look, if you're an obstetrician gynecologist, or even just a certified, a licensed physician, then you can go ahead and do these things. Now, you may be if you have a medical practice, there may be some regulations that apply to you, but they don't apply to you in any special sense because you're performing abortions versus some other medical treatment.
But you brought up an incredibly important issue, which is if it's not the responsibility of the health department to inspect some of these clinics that are doing abortions for the reasons that you stated, then what answer did you get on the question of whose responsibility is it? Because if all of these abortion clinics are falling through the cracks and some woman hemorrhages or dies just as her baby dies in an abortion clinic, nobody's watching these people at all?
That's correct, yeah. And the answer we have is pretty clear. Both the city and the state indicate that they don't think they have the authority or the responsibility to do it.
That's
now,
crazy.
It's important to note that there's a difference here between, abortion clinics, which are, we all think of, sort of a standalone organization that primarily does abortions and related services, and, a doctor's office. So when Guttmacher says, there's 225 abortion providers, they may be indicating it could be, 150 of those are, obstetrician gynecologists who do a couple of abortions a year for their own patients.
Right.
So the number of actual sort of standalone clinics may be lower, but according to Guttmacher and according to our research, it's probably somewhere in the vicinity of 95. But the real question I think that needs to be asked is, should these clinics be licensed? If they're operating as a clinic, as a standalone clinic who's providing abortion services, and they're not licensed, are they obligated to become licensed? And even if they're not obligated to become licensed, how could it be that no one has any oversight over these clinics? I don't think it makes a lot of sense for the Department of Health to go visit individual doctors' offices every year on the basis of, a small number of abortions. But certainly in terms of these standalone clinics, which exist all over the city, none of which are being inspected.
Right.
And perhaps the biggest point is that we don't know which clinics have been inspected and haven't, because the state refuses to release the names and the addresses of the clinics that were inspected and conversely the ones that weren't.
Incredible. Right, because they say they don't want them to be targeted. I mean, it's kind of a non-excuse there. But you look at Bill de Blasio, you look at this new mayor of New York who has vowed he's going to do everything to support the abortion lobby. He's going to do everything he can to shut down pro-lifers and the pregnancy centers and so forth. I mean, what incentive is there politically, really, to make any change and get more inspections done so you don't have another Gosnell situation?
That's an interesting question. I think at the level of the city, there's very little political incentive. The mayor is very liberal and very pro-abortion. He was just reelected last year, and the city council is, all but I think 3 of the members are Democrats, and not all of them. There are a number of pro-life Democrats in New York, but there are mostly pro-abortion Democrats running the city. But if you look up at the state's election is this year. Governor Cuomo is facing Rob Astorino, who's running against him as the Republican for the gubernatorial election this year. And the governor faces a difficult position because he spent last year advocating for this radical expansion of abortion through what he's dubbing the Women's Equality Act, which is sort of a Trojan horse involving, it's a 10-point bill. 9 of them are perfectly agreeable things relating to, sexual harassment and human trafficking and so forth. And the 10th is this expansion of late-term abortion, removing the 24-week limit, adding a health exception after viability, and allowing, more importantly, allowing non-doctors, people who are not doctors, other licensed, nurses and nurse practitioners and so forth, to perform abortions in New York State. So, unfortunately, I think Governor Cuomo has been tarred by the pro-abortion extremists in New York, who, he's stuck with their agenda. And Governor and Rob Astorino running against him is able to say, look, you guys aren't even inspecting clinics. So I think Astorino is put in a very strong position, certainly with his pro-life base, but even with moderate New Yorkers who maybe consider themselves pro-choice, but they think that the rate of abortion is too high in New York and that abortion absolutely must be safe for women. So I think at the level of New York State, it could be very interesting to see how this plays out in a political way.
Well, and remind listeners, because the abortion rate is really high in New York City, remind people, if you would, Greg, how many abortions are really taking place in New York City.
Right. So when we started our campaign, we launched the website nyc41percent.com. That was in 2011. We were using data from 2009. 41% of all pregnancies in New York City ended in abortion. I think at the time it was about 90,000 abortions in 2009 in New York.
Awesome.
Now, with the latest data we have is from 2012, the number is down to, I think, about 37, 38%, and the number of abortions is down somewhere in the vicinity of high 70s, 70,000 or maybe about 80,000 abortions. So there's been real progress in terms of the number of abortions and the rate of abortion in the last couple of years, but it's still absolutely astonishing, especially if you look at the outer boroughs, the Bronx, almost 50% of pregnancies end in abortion. There are zip codes in parts of New York where pushing 60% of pregnancies end in abortion. Which means that obviously a child is more likely to be aborted than to be born in some parts of New York City.
Well, now, Greg,
really, in this context, the idea that the city and the state are taking no responsibility to regulate abortion clinics, and they're in fact trying to expand late-term abortion and expand the number of people who can perform abortions by allowing nurses and nurse practitioners and midwives to perform abortions, it's really unconscionable.
Now, when they actually do inspections, Greg, what sorts of things do they take a look at? What sorts of things will be monitored during an inspection?
Right. So if you look at our website, NYC41%.com, I think there's a page there where we have the actual documents that we got from the city, thousands of pages. So you look through that, and there's all kinds of little things about, the light bulb and the exit sign and all this sort of stuff that you would expect. But there are a few things that are more concerning. There's a clinic that is not handling properly their soiled linens. They're keeping in the same room as the clean linens. There was a clinic that was keeping sterilized instruments beyond their expiration date. Instruments have to be sterilized and they have a date on them. If they go past date, they need to be sterilized again. There was a sterilization machine that wasn't being inspected regularly. There was a monitor that an anesthesiologist was using that wasn't working properly, so women were being sedated, and he wasn't able to monitor their vital signs. There's a clinic where they were refusing to have a nurse in the recovery room, as is required by law. There are serious infractions that have been found over the last 12. This is since 2000 that we asked for the data. So over about 13 years this was happening, and we don't know which clinics they were. We don't know what clinic it was that didn't have a nurse in the recovery room, and we don't know what clinic is storing the dirty linens in with the clean linens. I think women in New York have a right to know this.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to make sure people will check it out. And by going to your website, it's NYC41, the numeral 41%.com. And you can take a look at this. The health department failure to disclose puts women at risk. And it really, really does. And Greg Pfundstein from the Chiaroscuro Foundation, you do such great work there, Greg. We're so grateful for you. And we're really happy that you're able to spend some time with us. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks again for having me.